The Winter of Forgotten Letters. Viktor sat in his armchair, watching the fire flicker softly in the hearth. The snow outside fell in thick, gentle flakes, muffling the world beyond his window. The small mountain village was still, its streets buried under a blanket of white. Viktor's house, like his life, was quiet, filled only with the sounds of crackling wood and the steady ticking of the clock on the mantel. The winters had always been long here, but this one felt particularly heavy. At 68, Viktor had grown accustomed to the quiet, to the isolation that had settled into his life. His days of teaching at the village school were long behind him, and most of the people he had once known were either gone or scattered. His wife had passed years ago, and his son, Nikolai, had moved to the city, leaving Viktor alone in the home they once shared. He stared into the flames, the warmth of the fire doing little to chase away the cold that had settled deep inside him. It wasn't just the physical chill of winter. It was the quiet ache of loneliness, of time slipping away. He had stopped expecting visits from Nikolai, and the phone calls had become infrequent. Life, it seemed, had a way of moving on without him. Tonight, though, there was a restlessness in him. His gaze drifted toward the old desk in the corner of the room, a piece of furniture he hadn't touched in years. Without fully understanding why, Viktor rose from his chair and walked slowly toward it, his fingers brushing the worn wood as memories stirred faintly in his mind. He pulled open the top drawer, its contents as familiar as they were forgotten. Old pens, yellowing papers, remnants of a life long lived. But then, beneath the clutter, his hand found something he hadn't seen in years. A small bundle of letters, tied together with a faded red ribbon. For a moment, Viktor simply stared at the letters, his heart tightening as he held them. They were addressed to people who had once been a part of his life, people he had loved, but who were now long gone or lost to time. The letters had never been sent, each one written in a moment of regret or longing, then tucked away as if the act of writing them had been enough. But now, as Viktor stood there in the glow of the fire, the weight of those unsent letters pressed heavily on him. Slowly, he untied the ribbon and spread them out on the desk, each one a relic of a life he had left unfinished. His eyes settled on the first letter, addressed to his father. His hands trembled slightly as he picked it up. Viktor held the letter for a long moment before his trembling fingers carefully unfolded it. The paper was yellowed with age, the creases deep, but the ink, his own hurried handwriting, was still legible. His father's name, written on the front, stared up at him like an old ghost, pulling him back to a time and place he had tried to forget, but never could. He had written this letter over 40 years ago, just after his father's funeral. It was a letter filled with words he had never spoken aloud, written in the privacy of his room on a cold winter night, much like this one. But he had never sent it. Perhaps because there was no one left to send it to. Perhaps because it had felt too raw, too personal. Whatever the reason, he had sealed the letter and tucked it away, burying it along with his guilt, hoping that time would dull the ache. But time had not dulled it. As Viktor read the letter now, he could feel the guilt rising in his chest, as fresh as it had been all those years ago. The words on the page seemed to glow in the dim light, each sentence a reminder of what he had never said, of the apologies he had never made. "Father, I don't know where to begin. I don't know if you'd even want to hear from me, but I need to write this, even if it's too late. I know we never saw eye to eye, and I know I hurt you when I left the workshop to teach. I wasn't the son you wanted me to be. I thought my dreams were more important than yours, that I knew better. I was wrong. You were only trying to guide me, but I was too proud to see it. I'm sorry for the things I said. I'm sorry that we didn't part on better terms." Viktor's throat tightened as he read the words, each sentence stirring memories he had tried to suppress for years. His father had been a stern man, a man of few words who believed in hard work and tradition. He had expected Viktor to follow in his footsteps, to take over the family carpentry business, just as his father and grandfather had done before him. But Viktor had other dreams, dreams that didn't involve working with his hands in a dusty workshop. He had always been drawn to books, to ideas, to the kind of work that required thought and imagination rather than physical labor. Teaching had been his calling, and he had pursued it with passion, even though it had meant leaving the village and disappointing his father. The argument that had severed their relationship had been one of many, but it had been the worst. Viktor could still hear the echo of his father's angry voice, the way it had reverberated through the workshop on that bitter winter morning. "You'll regret this, Viktor," his father had said, his face flushed with anger. "You think teaching is a noble profession? You think it's going to put food on the table? You'll see. You're turning your back on everything this family built." Viktor had fired back with the arrogance of youth, his own voice rising to match his father's. "I'm not you. I don't want this life. I want to make a difference, to do something that matters. Books and words won't put a roof over your head," his father had muttered, turning his back to Viktor, his hands gripping the saw on the workbench. Viktor had stormed out, the words they had thrown at each other ringing in his ears. They hadn't spoken much after that. When his father grew ill, Viktor had stayed away, telling himself there would be time to reconcile, time to make things right. But there hadn't been time. His father had passed away suddenly, leaving Viktor with nothing but his guilt. He closed his eyes now, the memory of that argument swirling around him like the snow outside. He could still see his father's face, the lines etched deep with disappointment. His father had been right in many ways. Viktor had struggled financially for years as a teacher. It hadn't been the easy life he had imagined. But he had found fulfillment in the classroom, in teaching young minds to think for themselves. Still, none of that mattered in the face of the guilt he had carried for decades. "I know now what I couldn't understand then. You weren't angry because I chose a different path. You were angry because you cared, because you wanted me to succeed. I see that now. I wish I had told you that I understood. I wish I had said I loved you, that I appreciated everything you did for me. But I didn't. And now I have to live with that. I'm sorry, Father. I'm sorry I wasn't the son you wanted me to be. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me most. I hope, wherever you are, you can forgive me." The fire crackled softly, its warmth doing little to ease the coldness in Viktor's chest. He could almost hear his father's voice again, stern but not unkind. reminding him of his responsibilities, of the family legacy he had chosen to walk away from. Viktor had never resented his father for wanting him to stay, but he had resented the expectations, the feeling that his life had already been mapped out for him before he'd had a chance to choose. As a child, winter had always been the time when Viktor and his father would work together, cutting firewood in the snow, hauling logs back to the house. It had been one of the few times they shared something without the weight of expectation hanging over them. Viktor remembered those cold mornings, his father's steady presence beside him, the sound of the axe splitting wood, and the rare but welcome moments when his father would smile, pleased with the work they had done. But as Viktor grew older, those moments had grown rarer. The weight of expectation had returned, and with it, the tension between them. The love was there. Viktor knew that now, but it had been buried beneath layers of pride and silence. They had never learned how to talk to each other, how to express what they truly felt. And now, it was too late. Viktor set the letter down, his hands shaking slightly. The words he had written all those years ago felt like a burden he had carried for far too long. His father was gone, and there was no way to undo the mistakes of the past. But writing the letter, even if it had never been sent, had been his way of trying to make peace with the man he had never fully understood. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint whistle of wind outside. Viktor sat in that stillness, his heart heavy with the weight of all the things he had never said. He wondered if his father had known, in those final days, how much Viktor had truly loved him, how much he had respected him, even if he had never said the words out loud. The regret lingered, like a shadow that had followed Viktor for decades. But as he stared at the letter, he felt something shift inside him, a soft release of the guilt he had carried for so long. He had never sent the letter, and he could never truly reconcile with his father. But perhaps, in reading it now, he could begin to forgive himself. Viktor closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the memories wash over him. His father's voice, his stern face, the echo of their last argument. They would always be with him. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of the guilt and make peace with the past. Viktor sat back in his chair, the weight of his father's letter still pressing on his heart. But as his eyes drifted to the next envelope in the pile, a different kind of ache began to stir within him. The name on this one was Anna, a name that hadn't crossed his lips in years, but had never truly left his heart. Carefully, he picked up the letter, tracing her name with the tip of his finger. Anna. He had written this letter long after she had gone, after life had taken her far away from the small village where they had once walked hand in hand. He had written it on a cold winter's night, much like this one, when the loneliness of her absence had finally become unbearable. But just like the others, he had never sent it. The letter was heavier than the one to his father. It was filled with words of love, of regret, of the things he had never had the courage to say to her when it had mattered. He had loved her, truly, deeply, but he had never told her that, not in the way she deserved. With a sigh, Viktor unfolded the letter, the paper fragile in his hands, and began to read. Anna, I've thought about you every day since you left. I know it's too late to tell you this, but I loved you. I've loved you all these years, and I never told you. I'm writing this letter not because I expect it to change anything, but because I need to say it. You were the brightest part of my life, and I let you slip away. I never had the courage to tell you what you meant to me. I hope, wherever you are, you found happiness. I hope you found someone who could give you what I couldn't. The words on the page blurred as Viktor's mind was pulled back to a different time. A time when his world had been filled with the brightness of Anna's laughter and the warmth of her touch. He could almost smell the scent of pine in the air, feel the crunch of snow beneath his boots, hear the soft whisper of the wind as it moved through the trees. Those were the days when winter had felt less lonely, when it had been filled with the promise of love. He closed his eyes, and the memory of that night came flooding back. It had been late December, the sky dark but filled with stars, the ground covered in a fresh layer of snow that sparkled under the moonlight. Anna had met him at the edge of the village, her cheeks flushed with cold, her eyes bright and filled with a kind of quiet joy that always made Viktor's heart ache. They had walked together, side by side, through the snow-covered woods. The world had been silent, save for the occasional rustle of branches or the distant hoot of an owl. Viktor remembered the way Anna's gloved hand had brushed against his, the warmth of her presence filling the cold night air. They had talked for hours that evening about their dreams, their plans for the future. Anna had always been filled with hope, with a sense of wonder that Viktor had admired deeply. She had wanted to see the world, to travel beyond the boundaries of the small village they had both grown up in. Viktor had wanted to tell her then, in that moment, that she was his world, that he couldn't imagine a future without her. He had even brought a ring with him that night, tucked deep in his coat pocket, hidden away until the perfect moment. But the perfect moment had never come. Something had held him back. Perhaps it was the fear of rejection, the thought that Anna's dreams were too big for the life he could offer her. Or maybe it had been his own insecurities, the belief that he wasn't enough for her, that he couldn't be the man she needed. Whatever it was, Viktor had let the moment pass, and they had parted that night with nothing more than a soft goodbye. He had watched her walk away, her figure growing smaller and smaller until she disappeared into the shadows of the trees. And with her, the future he had imagined for himself vanished too. The letter trembled in Viktor's hands as he read the next lines, his heart heavy with the weight of what might have been. I always meant to tell you, but I was a coward. I thought I had time, that we had time, but I was wrong. You left, and I never told you the truth. I wanted to marry you, Anna. I had a ring that night, hidden in my pocket. I had planned to ask you, but something held me back. Maybe I was afraid you would say no, or maybe I was afraid you'd say yes. I'll never know now. Anna had left the village not long after that night. She had written him a letter, telling him about her plans to move to the city, to study at the university there. She had been excited, filled with the possibilities of a new life, and Viktor had been happy for her. Truly, he had. But there had been a hollow space in his chest ever since, a space that had once been filled with her presence. He had written this letter to her years later, after he heard through old friends that she had married and moved even farther away. By then, it had felt pointless to send the letter. She had built a life without him, and Viktor had been left alone, wondering what might have been. The memory of her still lingered in his mind, even now, all these years later. He could still see her smile, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed. He could still hear her voice, soft and lilting, telling him about all the places she wanted to see, all the things she wanted to do. She had been full of life, and Viktor had been too afraid to tell her that she was the one thing he truly wanted. I hope you're happy now. I hope you found the life you always dreamed of. I'm sorry I never told you how I felt. I'm sorry I wasn't braver. Maybe if I had been, things would have turned out differently. But I want you to know, even if it's too late, that I loved you. I always did. Viktor set the letter down, his heart heavy with the weight of all the things he had never said. Anna had been the love of his life, but he had let her slip away, too afraid to act on the feelings he had carried with him for so long. He had told himself that it was better this way, that Anna had gone on to find happiness, and that he had spared them both the pain of a rejection that might have come if he had confessed his love. But now, sitting in the quiet of his empty house, Viktor wondered if he had been wrong. What if he had told her? What if he had proposed that night in the woods, the ring in his pocket shining under the moonlight? What if Anna had said yes? His life, so filled with loneliness and regret, might have been something entirely different. He had carried the burden of that missed opportunity for decades, replaying the moment over and over again in his mind, wondering how things might have turned out if he had been braver, if he had acted on his feelings rather than letting fear hold him back. But the truth was, he would never know. Anna was gone, and so was the future they might have had together. All that remained were the memories of what could have been, and the faint echo of her laughter in the quiet of his mind. Viktor sighed deeply and placed the letter back on the desk. He couldn't change the past, couldn't rewrite the story of his life with Anna. But in reading the letter now, he could at least acknowledge the love he had carried for her all these years and the regret that had come with it. It was a bittersweet memory, but it was his, and that, at least, was something. Viktor's hands trembled as he placed Anna's letter on the table. The next envelope was smaller, more worn, and the handwriting on it was messier than the others. The name on it was both familiar and distant, Alexei, a name that once had been synonymous with late-night discussions, laughter, and shared dreams. But like so many other things in Viktor's life, that friendship had withered, undone by pride, time, and the quiet erosion of ideals. Alexei had been Viktor's closest friend during his early teaching days, when they were both young men full of hope and ambition. They had met during a teacher's training course in the city, bonding over their shared love for books, philosophy, and the desire to change the world. Their conversations had stretched long into the night, their heads filled with the great thinkers, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Marx, believing they could shape the future with their minds and their words. But time had a way of unraveling those grand dreams. Slowly, imperceptibly, their ideas had begun to diverge, and the friendship that once felt unbreakable had cracked. Viktor sighed, his fingers tracing the edge of the letter. It had been written not long after their final argument, an apology he had never sent. He had meant to reach out, to make amends, but his pride had stopped him. Now, as he sat in his quiet home, alone with his memories, Viktor wondered if Alexei was still alive. If somewhere, across the miles, his old friend still thought of him, or if their friendship had faded from memory like an old photograph left too long in the sun. With a heavy heart, Viktor unfolded the letter. Alexei, it has been too long, my old friend. Too long since we spoke. Too long since we laughed together. I've been carrying the weight of our last argument for years, and I need to say this, even if you never read it. I was wrong. I was too proud, too stubborn to see that our differences didn't have to come between us. Viktor could still remember the night of that last argument with painful clarity. It had been winter then too, the air crisp with frost as they sat in Alexei's small apartment, the warmth of the fire doing little to temper the heat of their discussion. They had been discussing politics, a topic they had always approached with caution in the past, knowing it was a delicate subject. But that night, something had shifted. Their differences, once an interesting contrast of perspectives, had become a point of contention. Alexei had always leaned toward more radical ideas, while Viktor, though idealistic, preferred gradual change. They had debated these things before, but this time, the conversation had turned personal. Alexei had accused Viktor of becoming complacent, of losing the fire he once had to reshape society, to fight for the underprivileged and downtrodden. You've become comfortable in your life, Alexei had said, his voice tinged with disappointment. You talk about teaching, about shaping young minds, but you're not doing anything to challenge the system. You've become a part of it. Viktor had bristled at the accusation. He had prided himself on his role as a teacher, on the subtle ways he influenced his students' thinking, encouraging them to question authority, to think critically. But Alexei had always been more direct, more impatient for revolution. And what about you? Viktor had fired back. What are you doing, other than sitting in this apartment and talking about change? Words aren't enough, Alexei. Sometimes it's better to do what you can, where you can, rather than waiting for the perfect moment to dismantle the world. Their voices had risen, each man's convictions hardening, and in the end, it wasn't the politics that had severed their friendship. It was their pride. Neither had been willing to concede, and when Viktor had stormed out of Alexei's apartment that night, he had known something precious had been broken. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. Our friendship was more important than those debates. I should have reached out to you sooner, but my pride kept me from doing it. I was afraid you would reject me, that our differences had grown too great. But now, as I sit here with nothing but time, I realize how foolish I was. As Viktor read his own words, he could feel the weight of that regret pressing down on him. Alexei had been more than a friend. He had been a kindred spirit, someone who had understood Viktor in a way few others did. They had shared everything once, books, ideas, dreams. But all it had taken was one heated argument to tear them apart. Viktor could still picture Alexei's face, framed by the soft glow of the firelight. His friend's dark eyes had always been intense, filled with passion for the causes he believed in. They had spent so many nights sitting together, talking about how they would change the world, about how their lives would matter, would mean something. But the years had passed, and those grand dreams had faded, just as their friendship had. Viktor had settled into his role as a teacher, content to shape his small corner of the world. He had found meaning in the quiet influence he had over his students, while Alexei had drifted into more radical circles, his life consumed by causes that had eventually taken him far away from the village. Viktor had always meant to reach out, to send this letter and rebuild the bridge between them. But something had always stopped him. The fear that Alexei wouldn't want to hear from him, that their friendship had meant less to Alexei than it had to him. So he had put the letter away, just as he had put away so many other things in his life. I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if you're still alive. But if you are, and if you remember me, I want you to know that I miss you. I miss our conversations, our laughter, the way we used to talk about the future as if it was something we could mold with our hands. If you're out there, Alexei, I hope you found peace. I hope you found what you were looking for. I know now that I was wrong to let pride come between us. I hope someday we can sit together again as we once did and leave the past behind us. Viktor set the letter down, his heart heavy with the weight of all the years that had passed. He wondered if Alexei had ever thought of him, if somewhere in the world his old friend was still fighting for the causes he had believed in so deeply. Or had time taken Alexei too, leaving Viktor with nothing but memories of the man he had once called brother. Friendships, Viktor realized, were fragile things. They required care, attention, the willingness to reach out and mend the cracks when they appeared. But he had let pride and stubbornness get in the way, and now, like so many other things in his life, that friendship was lost to time. He wondered what might have happened if he had sent the letter when he had first written it. Perhaps Alexei would have responded. Perhaps they could have rebuilt what had been broken. Or perhaps, like so many others, Alexei had moved on, leaving Viktor behind in the small village where they had once dreamed of changing the world. The fire crackled softly, the sound filling the quiet room. Viktor stared into the flames, his mind drifting back to those late nights, to the discussions that had once filled him with so much hope. He could still hear Alexei's voice, passionate and determined, urging him to believe in something bigger than himself. But that voice was only a memory now, an echo of a past that Viktor couldn't reclaim. Wherever you are, Alexei, I hope you've found your peace. I hope you've forgiven me, just as I am learning to forgive myself. Viktor placed the letter back on the desk, his heart heavy with the weight of missed opportunities. Like his relationship with his father, his friendship with Alexei had been lost, not because of fate, but because of his own inability to reach out when it mattered. He sighed deeply, the regret settling over him like a blanket of snow. Friendships were easy to lose and hard to rebuild. He knew that now, but the knowledge came too late. The fire flickered, the flames dancing in the hearth, and Viktor wondered if somewhere Alexei was sitting by a fire too, thinking of their old friendship, or if he had forgotten Viktor entirely. Either way, the letter remained unsent, and and Viktor was left with the silence of what might have been. The final letter sat alone on the table, its edges slightly curled from age, the paper soft from the many times Viktor had held it, contemplating whether to send it. This one was different from the others, not because of the words inside, but because of the name written across the front in his careful script. Nikolai, his son. Viktor had written this letter only a few years ago, after their last visit together. That visit had been strained, their conversations more distant than the physical miles between them. Nikolai had moved to the city years before, pursuing a career in business that Viktor had never understood, let alone supported. Their relationship, once filled with laughter and closeness, had slowly deteriorated into awkward silences and occasional phone calls. Each visit had become more painful than the last, a reminder of how much distance had grown between them, emotionally as much as geographically. Nikolai, I'm writing this because I don't know how else to say it. Every time we talk, it feels like we're speaking two different languages, and I don't know how to bridge that gap. I know we've had our differences, and I know I haven't been the easiest father to talk to. I've been hard on you, harder than I should have been. I see that now. He picked up the letter and sighed. He had written it in a moment of vulnerability, intending to apologize for the harsh words exchanged during Nikolai's last visit. But as with the others, his pride had gotten in the way, and the letter had been sealed, never to be sent. With trembling hands, Viktor opened the envelope, unfolding the familiar paper. The words were as raw and real as they had been the day he'd written them. Viktor's throat tightened as he read the words. He could see Nikolai as a child, so small, so full of energy and curiosity, always wanting to please his father. He had loved that boy fiercely, but somewhere along the way, his love had turned into criticism, and his affection had been overshadowed by the weight of his own expectations. He closed his eyes, letting the memory of a winter afternoon flood back to him. It had been one of those perfect winter days, the kind where the snow fell in thick, soft flakes, coating the world in white. Nikolai had been 7, his small hands bundled in mittens, his nose red from the cold. They had spent the afternoon in the yard, building a snowman together, their laughter filling the air. Viktor could still hear it, the way Nikolai's voice had rung out with pure joy as they rolled the snow into big, clumsy balls, stacking them one on top of the other. "Papa, look!" Nikolai had shouted, his eyes sparkling as he carefully placed 2 stones for the snowman's eyes. "He's perfect." Viktor had smiled, his heart swelling with pride as he helped his son pack the snow tighter around the base. They had worked together for hours, adding twigs for arms and a scarf around the snowman's neck. It had been one of those rare, unguarded moments when everything had felt right. Just the 2 of them, together, with no expectations or pressures. But that had been years ago, and somewhere between the boy Nikolai had been and the man he had become, things had changed. Viktor couldn't pinpoint when exactly, but their relationship had shifted. Maybe it had been Nikolai's decision to leave the village for the city, to pursue a career in business rather than something Viktor had hoped for, something more familiar. Or maybe it was the natural distance that forms between father and son as the son grows older, more independent, more his own person. Whatever the reason, the closeness they had once shared had dissolved into something neither of them could name. I know I've said things that hurt you. I've been too quick to judge your choices, too slow to support you in the life you've built for yourself. I didn't understand why you wanted to leave the village, why you couldn't find satisfaction here. But I see now that it wasn't about me. It was about you and your need to create a life of your own. I see that now, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Viktor's hand trembled as he set the letter down for a moment, his eyes burning with unshed tears. It had always been difficult for him to express how he felt. His own father had never shown much emotion, and Viktor had inherited that same stoicism, believing that love was something understood, not spoken. But that belief had cost him. It had cost him his relationship with his son. He remembered the last time Nikolai had visited. It had been Christmas, the tension between them palpable from the moment Nikolai walked through the door. They had spent the first few hours in polite conversation, skirting around the real issues, until finally, Viktor had made a passing comment about Nikolai's career. Something small, something critical, but it had been enough to spark an argument. Their words had been sharp, neither of them willing to back down. "I've built a life for myself, Papa," Nikolai had said, his voice tight with frustration. "Why can't you just accept that?" Viktor hadn't answered. He hadn't known how to. And just like that, Nikolai had left early, the space between them feeling larger than ever. "I don't know how to fix what's broken between us, but I want to try. I miss you, Nikolai. I miss the boy you were, and I miss the man you've become, even though I haven't said it. I'm proud of you, even if I haven't shown it. I'm sorry for all the things I didn't say, and for the things I did say that hurt you. I hope it's not too late for us to find a way back to each other." Viktor folded the letter and set it down on the table, his heart heavy with the weight of all the unsaid words that had accumulated over the years. He had never sent the letter, too afraid that Nikolai wouldn't want to hear from him, that the damage had already been done. But as he sat there now, staring at the envelope with his son's name on it, he realized that this was different from the other letters. His father was gone. Anna was gone. Alexei, too, was likely out of his reach. But Nikolai was still here. There was still time. Viktor felt a sudden rush of clarity, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. For the first time that evening, Viktor stood up with a sense of urgency. He grabbed a fresh envelope, carefully folded the letter once again, and slid it inside. This time, he sealed it. This time, he would send it. With the letter clutched in his hand, Viktor felt a weight lift from his chest. The fire crackled softly behind him, the snow falling gently outside. And as he stood there, in the quiet warmth of his home, he allowed himself to hope, for the first time in years, that it wasn't too late to mend the bond with his son. Viktor sat at the desk, the 4 letters spread out before him like fragments of a life long gone. Each one represented a part of his past, filled with the words he had never spoken, the apologies he had never made, the love he had never fully expressed. They were his regrets, his missed opportunities, and no matter how deeply he wished it, he couldn't go back and change what had already passed. But tonight, as he stared at the last letter, the one addressed to his son Nikolai, something shifted inside him. He had spent so many years trapped in the isolation of his own making, too proud, too afraid to reach out. But the future, unlike the past, was still within his grasp. Nikolai was still here. There was still time. The other letters, to his father, to Anna, to Alexei, were relics of relationships lost to time. But his relationship with Nikolai, though fractured, wasn't gone. It wasn't beyond repair. For the first time in years, Viktor felt the weight of that realization settle over him. He could still act. He could still reach out. He took a deep breath, reached for a blank sheet of paper, and began to write. This letter was different. It wasn't full of apologies or grand gestures. It was simple and heartfelt. He wrote about the things that mattered, about what had been left unsaid for too long. Nikolai, I miss you. I know we've had our differences, and I know I've been hard on you. But that doesn't change the fact that I'm proud of you. I don't say it enough, and I should have said it years ago, but I want to say it now. I'm proud of the life you've built, of the man you've become. I want to see you again, whenever you're ready. The door is always open. Viktor paused for a moment, his pen hovering above the paper. He didn't need to say more. The letter wasn't about fixing everything all at once. It was about opening the door to a new beginning. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it. For the first time in years, he placed it by the door, ready to send in the morning. His heart felt lighter, as though the burden of so many unsent words had finally begun to lift. As Viktor moved toward the window, he glanced outside at the snow, which was still falling gently over the village. The world was covered in white, the landscape softened by the quiet blanket that coated the trees and rooftops. There was something peaceful about the snow, something that felt like a fresh start. It reminded Viktor that even in the coldest, most isolating moments, there was always the possibility of renewal. Beneath the stillness, life continued. For the first time in years, Viktor felt a sense of hope. Not everything could be mended. He knew that. Some relationships, like those with his father, Anna, and Alexei, were too far gone. But that didn't mean the future had to be lost as well. The fire crackled softly in the hearth as Viktor moved back toward his chair. He felt a quiet peace settle over him, knowing that he had taken the first step. The path ahead with Nikolai might still be uncertain, but the door was open. As he sat down and closed his eyes, Viktor felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence, and as Viktor drifted to sleep, the warmth of the fire wrapped around him like an embrace. For the first time in years, he felt ready to face the future.